They threw her trunk into the snow at 7 years old, and the only thing Elsa Mikkonen kept from that day was the smell of her mother's lye soap still wet on her knuckles, and the sound of her father's voice saying, in Finnish, "One less mouth, and the cow lives through February." 23 years later, standing on the shore of Kilpisjärvi Lake in the Montana Territory, watching her husband's pine coffin lowered into frozen ground, she thought it was strange how being discarded gets easier each time, like a bone that breaks and heals thicker, uglier, but harder to snap again. The minister finished. The 6 men who had carried Toivo Mikkonen's coffin stood with their hats against their chests, steam curling from their mouths into air so cold it cracked the moisture in your nostrils. Elsa's fingers ached inside her wool mittens. She could feel the lake behind her, enormous and silent under its sheet of November ice. And she thought about how Toivo had loved that lake, had spent 3 summers mapping its bottom with a weighted rope, filling a leather journal with depth measurements and sketches of the lakebed's contours. She never understood why. She understood now that she would never understand. Mrs. Mikkonen, that was Gerald Voss, the land assessor for Kilpisjärvi Township. He waited until the other men had shuffled back toward the wagon road before approaching. He was holding a folded document against the wind, one corner flapping. "I'm sorry to do this today." "Then don't," Elsa said. "The territorial claim on your homestead." He unfolded the paper anyway. His fingertips were white. Toivo filed under the Timber Culture Act. 3 years of improvement required. He planted 12 acres of cottonwood, but the filing was in his name only, and without a living claimant. "I am a living claimant. I am his wife." Voss looked at the ground. He had a small scar on his chin shaped like a fishhook, and when he was uncomfortable, he touched it. He touched it now. The amended filing requires the original homesteader or a male heir. You have neither. I'm sorry, Elsa. The claim reverts to territorial jurisdiction in 30 days. 30 days. The first week of December. The temperature had not climbed above 10 degrees in 2 weeks, and the real cold had not even started. Elsa looked past Voss toward the cluster of buildings that made up Kilpisjärvi. Population 141, now 140. She could see the mercantile, the assay office, the 2 saloons. She could see Martha Gruber sweeping her porch and pretending not to watch. "Where am I supposed to go?" Elsa asked, though she already knew the answer. The answer was that nobody had thought about that part. Voss folded the document back into his coat. Josiah Pembroke at the bank mentioned he could offer a fair price for your furniture and stores. Enough for a rail ticket to Helena, maybe, Beauty. He paused. "You've got skills, Elsa. You'd find work skills." She was 30 years old. She could split wood faster than most men in town, could judge soil temperature by pressing her wrist to the ground, could read weather in the way magpies plastered on fence posts. She could deliver a calf in the dark. She could build a smokehouse. None of these things were skills that mattered to a woman standing on the wrong side of a legal document in November of 1887, and Voss knew it, and she knew it, and the silence between them was the sound of that knowing. She heard it then from somewhere near the wagons, not quite whispered enough. Clara Pembroke's voice, the banker's wife, carrying in the still air the way sound travels over ice. She could always go back to wherever Finns come from. Aren't they used to the cold? Laughter, thin and scattered. Elsa did not turn around. She stood at her husband's grave and looked at the lake. The ice was already 8 inches thick, pale blue where the wind had scoured the snow away. Toivo's journal was in her coat pocket. She had been carrying it since the morning he died, the leather warm against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She did not know yet what the journal contained that would save her. She did not know that 31 people from Kilpisjärvi would be alive because of it. She knew only that she was not getting on a train to Helena, and she was not going back to wherever Finns come from, and she was not one less mouth. She had been one less mouth once. She would not be again. The first 3 days after the funeral, Elsa did not leave the cabin. She catalogued everything she owned. 2 iron pots, 1 cracked, a buck saw with a loose handle, 40 pounds of dried elk, most of it too salty because Toivo had been generous with the cure, 17 jars of preserved service breeze, a .44 Henry rifle with 9 cartridges, 1 milk cow named Patka, which was Finnish for short because the cow was short, and the journal. She opened it on the third night, sitting close to the stove because the cabin walls were already letting the cold seep through. Tolibor had not been a talker. He had been the kind of man who would walk 8 miles to check a fence line and come back saying only, "Fence is fine." But in this journal he had written everything. Depth readings for Kilpisjärvi Lake, yes, but also sketches of the lake bed geology, notes about gas bubbles rising through certain fissures, temperature readings taken through holes cut in the ice. On page 47, circled 3 times in pencil, Toivo had written, Northwest Cove. Ice thin at this point even in January. Water temp 58 degrees at 3 feet. Sulfur smell. Geothermal vent confirmed. Elsa read the entry twice. She knew what a geothermal vent was. Her father, before the day with the trunk and the snow, had been a copper miner in the Upper Peninsula. She had heard him talk about hot springs, about places where the earth's heat pushed through rock and warmed water from below. She had bathed in one once, at 4 years old, in a place where steam rose from a creek bed and the rocks were coated in yellow mineral crust. She turned the page. Toivo had drawn a map. The northwest cove of Kilpisjärvi Lake, where the shoreline curved into a shallow bay sheltered by a basalt ridge. He had marked the vent location with a star. Below it he had written something that made her sit up straight and bring the lantern closer. Root structure of shoreline spruce extends under ice shelf into thermal zone. Trees at Northwest Cove show 2 to 3 times the growth rate. Root mass in warm water is extraordinary. Living lattice underneath the ice, living lattice. She stared at those words. She thought about the cottonwood Toivo had planted on their homestead claim, those 12 acres of thin, struggling saplings. She thought about the territorial filing that required tree cultivation. And she thought about the frozen lake which belonged to no one, which was territorial common land which any citizen could use. The idea arrived not as a flash, but as a slow warmth, the way you feel a hot spring before you see it. She would plant trees at the Northwest Cove, not cottonwood, which would die in the cold. Spruce and willow, species whose roots sought water, whose root systems could reach down through the ice shelf into the geothermal warmth below. She would build not a homestead, but a living nursery on the lake's edge, where the warm water would keep the roots alive through winter, where the trees would grow faster than anyone thought possible. It was insane. It was the kind of idea that gets a woman laughed out of a land office. She closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. Through the cabin wall she could hear the wind off the lake, a low moan that sounded like something breathing underneath a very large, very cold blanket. "All right, Toivo," she said to the empty room. "I'll trust your map." She started the next morning at false dawn, the sky the color of a bruise. She harnessed Padka to the small sledge and loaded her tools, her provisions, and the journal. The trail to the Northwest Cove was 3 miles along the lakeshore, through timber so thick the branches interlocked overhead and filtered the early light into something gray and submarine. The cove was exactly as Toivo had drawn it. A crescent to shoreline maybe 200 feet across, backed by the basalt ridge that blocked the north wind. The ice in the cove was thinner than the main lake. She could see it, the color different, more green than blue. And in one spot near the shore the surface was wet, a patch of slush where the thermal water was fighting the freeze. She knelt and pulled off her mitten. Pressed her bare hand to the wet spot. Warm, not hot, but warm, maybe 50 degrees, in air that was 6 below zero. She could feel the heat radiating up through the ice like a living pulse. She cried then, not from sadness, from the particular relief of discovering that the world contains one thing you did not expect, exactly when you need it. The first task was shelter. She could not live in the cabin 3 miles away and work the cove. She needed to be here. The basalt ridge, she discovered on her second day, was not solid. There was a fracture along its base, a narrow opening she had to turn sideways to enter, that led into a shallow cave, maybe 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The ceiling was low, she could not stand fully upright. The floor was dry sand and gravel, and it was warm, not comfortable. Not home. The walls sweated with mineral condensation and the air tasted like matches. But the geothermal heat rising through the rock kept the cave above freezing, even when outside the air could kill exposed skin in minutes. She calculated, using Torfibo's temperature notes, that the cave floor stayed between 38 and 45 degrees through the winter. Cold enough to see your breath. Warm enough to sleep without dying. She sealed the entrance with a frame of spruce poles and packed the gaps with a mixture of lake mud and dried grass, the way Ojibwe builders constructed winter lodges. She had learned this from a Metis woman named Corinne, who had wintered near the Mekonnen homestead 2 years before, trading smoked fish for flour. Corinne had shown her how the mud and grass mixture, when frozen, became harder than wood and held warmth better than any milled lumber. For the entrance itself, she hung a double layer of elk hide with a gap between them, creating a dead air pocket that acted as insulation. The principle was the same as a double-paned window, though that technology would not exist for decades. Elsa did not know she was ahead of her time. She knew only that 2 hides were warmer than 1 when you left space between them. Inside the cave, she built a sleeping platform raised 18 inches off the ground because warm air rises in cold air pools, and the difference between sleeping on the ground and sleeping 18 inches up could be the difference between frostbite and a tolerable night. She filled the platform base with dried spruce needles, which contained enough resin to repel moisture and enough air pockets to insulate. The trees were the real work. She began with willow because willow is desperate to live. Cut a willow branch, stick it in wet ground, and it will root. It does not ask for good soil or gentle weather. It wants water, and it will forgive almost everything else. She cut 200 willow switches from a stand upstream, each one 3 feet long and thick as her thumb. She carried them to the cove in bundles of 20 strapped to her back. Along the shoreline, where the ice was thinnest and the thermal water kept the ground soft, she drove the switches into the mud at 2-foot intervals. The warmth below would keep the root zone active. The willows would not go dormant. They would grow roots all winter, reaching down into water that was 58 degrees, while the air above them was 40 below. She planted spruce seedlings behind the willows in the sheltered curve of the ridge. She packed their bases with the same mud and grass mixture she had used on her shelter, creating insulation mounds that held ground heat around the root balls. Toribo's journal had noted that the shoreline spruce near the vent had root masses 3 times normal size. She was betting her life that he was right. It took her 19 days. Her hands cracked and bled. The skin on her face became so chapped it looked like old leather. Batka stood in the lee of the ridge, patient as a stone, eating the dried grass Elsa hauled in by the sledge load. On the 20th day, Gerald Voss appeared at the cove. He stood at the edge of the tree line, watching her dry willow switches into the frozen shoreline, and his face held an expression she could not read, something between pity and confusion. "Asa, what are you doing? Planting? On the lake? On territorial common land?" She did not stop working. "Any citizen has the right to cultivate common land, Gerald. Section 14 of the Territorial Code. You're planting sticks in ice." "I'm planting willow and spruce in geothermally heated lakeshore soil. The roots will reach the thermal water beneath the ice shelf. They will grow." Voss touched the fishhook scar on his chin. "People in town are talking. People in town can talk." He looked at the cave entrance, at the elk-hide curtain, at the thin curl of smoke rising from the ventilation gap she had cut in the mud seal. "You're living in a crack in a rock. I'm living in a geothermally insulated shelter with a constant ambient temperature above freezing. Your house has gaps in the chinking. I can see daylight through, Gerald. How's your ambient temperature?" He left without answering. She knew what he would say in town. She knew the words, crazy thin woman planting sticks in a frozen lake, living in a hole in a rock like an animal. She had been discarded before. The words had less weight each time. What mattered was that 3 days after Voss's visit, she checked the first willows she had planted and found, below the ice line, pale white filaments extending from the cut ends into the warm mud. Roots, alive and going in December. She pressed her hand against the willow switch and felt it firm underground, anchored, reaching for warmth the way all living things reach for warmth. "Good," she said, "not to the tree, not to Torlibo, to herself." The Great Blizzard of 1887 arrived on January 12th. Old-timers in the territory later called it the Children's Blizzard, though in Kilpiarvi they had their own name for it, a Finnish word Elsa's father would have known, a word that meant the breath of something that has no lungs. The morning started mild. 34 degrees, warm enough that children in town were sent to school without heavy coats. Clara Pembroke hung laundry on her line. Josiah Pembroke left the bank doors propped open because the stove was making the office stuffy. The temperature dropped 46 degrees in 2 hours. The sky went from grey to black to a white so dense and violent it erased the world. The wind came from the northwest at 60 miles an hour, carrying snow so fine and hard it cut exposed skin. Visibility dropped to 0. A person could not see their own hand at arm's length. Elsa was inside her cave when the blizzard hit. She heard the wind change pitch, from moan to scream to something beyond sound, a pressure that she felt in her teeth and her sternum. She checked the elk-hide door. The dead air pocket between the layers was holding. The temperature inside the cave was 41 degrees. Outside it was 38 below 0 and falling. She sat on her sleeping platform and listened to the world try to tear itself apart. In Kilpijavi, the destruction was methodical. The wind-peeled roofing shakes off the mercantile like fingernails. The front wall of the schoolhouse bowed inward, and the teacher, a woman named Ada Spence, pressed her body against it while 14 children huddled behind the stove. The windows of both saloons blew in. Snow filled the rooms in minutes, chest deep, so cold it did not melt even near the stoves. The Pembroke house, the finest in town, had those gaps in the chinking that Elsa had noticed. The wind found everyone. Within an hour the interior temperature was below 0. Clara Pembroke wrapped her 2 children in every blanket in the house and put them in the root cellar, which was warmer but not warm enough, not for a storm that would last 3 days. Gerald Voss's house lost its chimney at 4 in the afternoon. The stove became useless. He tried to seal the chimney hole with a horse blanket, and the wind tore it from his hands and took 3 of his fingers with it, the nails ripped clean off by the frozen fabric. His wife found him kneeling on the floor, holding his bleeding hand against his chest, saying, "Oh," over and over, just "oh," because the pain was larger than any word he had for it. By nightfall of the first day, 6 homes in Kilpijavi were uninhabitable. By the morning of the second day, the number was 14. The town's entire firewood supply, stacked in open cords behind each house, was buried under drifts 8 feet deep. 3 cattle froze standing in a field, their legs locked, their eyes open, coated in ice so thick they looked like glass sculptures of themselves. And on the shore of the northwest cove of Kilpijavi Lake, 200 willow switches and 40 spruce seedlings stood upright in the screaming wind. The basalt ridge broke the worst of the gale. The geothermal heat kept the root zone above freezing. The willows bent but did not break, their young root systems now 12 inches deep in warm mud, interlocked beneath the ice shelf in exactly the kind of living lattice Tefevo had described. The ice in the cove groaned, it cracked. A fissure opened 6 feet from shore, and through it rose a column of steam from the thermal water below, and the crack ran along the root line of the willows, and the roots held the ice together at the edges like stitches in a wound, and beneath the ice in the warm water. Something was breathing. Not something, everything. The root mass was alive, growing, respiring, pulling oxygen from the thermal water and releasing it, and the crack in the ice became a vent, and the steam rose into the blizzard and was torn away by the wind, and the roots held. Elsa watched from inside her cave. She could see the crack through a gap in her door seal. She could see the steam. She thought about the phrase living lattice, and understood now that Tefevo had not been describing a botanical curiosity. He had been describing a survival system. The trees held the shoreline, the roots held the ice, the thermal water kept everything alive. It was an organism, a community of roots and water and warmth, and she was part of it. On the second day of the blizzard, Gerald Voss appeared at the cave entrance. She almost did not recognize him. His face was white except where it was black, the first signs of severe frostbite on his nose and left ear. His fingers were bandaged and strips torn from a shirt, the wrapping already stiff with frozen blood. He was carrying his youngest child, a boy of 3, against his chest inside his coat. Behind him, barely visible in the driving snow, were others. She counted 11, then 15, then more. Shapes in the white stumbling, hunched, following the basalt ridge to the cove, because the ridge was the only landmark that could be followed blind. Elsa. Loss's voice was destroyed. scraped raw by cold air. The town, most of the houses. They can't. Come in, she said. She pulled the elk hide aside and they came. One by one, then in clusters. Ada Spence and her 14 schoolchildren, the children so cold they had stopped shivering, which was worse, which meant the body was giving up. Clara Pembroke with her 2 children, her laundry line hands now purple and split at the knuckles. Josiah Pembroke, the banker who had offered Elsa fair price for her furniture, who was now shaking so violently his teeth had chipped against each other. 31 people in a cave 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide. There was not room to sit. They stood pressed together, body heat compounding the geothermal warmth, and the temperature inside the cave climbed to 52 degrees, which was not comfortable, which was survival. Elsa gave Ada Spence's children her dried elk meat, strips of it, and told them to hold it in their mouths and let it soften before chewing, because their jaw muscles were too cold to work. She showed Voss how to hold his damaged fingers against his own stomach, not near the stove, because warming frostbite too fast destroys the tissue worse than the cold. She had learned this from Corinne the Metis woman, who had learned it from her grandmother, who had learned it from a country where winter was not a season, but a permanent condition of existence. Clara Pembroke was sitting on the floor of the cave, her back against the warm rock, her children asleep against her sides. She looked up at Elsa with an expression that Elsa recognized from her own face. From the day she stood in the snow at 7 years old, watching her trunk land in a drift. "I said a terrible thing about you," Clara said. Her voice was very quiet. "At the funeral. About going back to where you came from." "I heard you," Elsa said. "I'm sorry." Clara paused. "I say terrible things when I'm frightened. My mother was the same. She'd go mean when things got bad, like a dog that bites when it's cornered. It's not." She stopped, looked at her sleeping children. "It's not an excuse. I just wanted you to know it wasn't about you. It was never about you." Elsa said nothing for a long time. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out the jar of service berries, the last one, and handed it to Clara. "Feed your children when they wake up." The blizzard lasted 3 days. On the 3rd morning, the wind dropped so suddenly it was like going deaf. Elsa pushed open the elk hide door, and the world outside was white and still and scoured. The snow packed so hard you could walk on it without sinking. The sky scrubbed to a blue so deep it looked like something you could fall into. The willow switches stood in their rows along the shoreline. Snow was packed against their bases, frozen solid, but the stems rose above it, thin and dark and alive. She walked to the nearest one and brushed the snow from its base. At the soil line where the switch entered the warm earth, she could see a collar of green, new growth, in January, after a blizzard that had killed cattle where they stood. She looked out at the ice. The crack was still there, a dark line running parallel to the shore, steam still rising from it in thin wisps. The roots beneath the ice were holding. The living lattice had survived. Behind her, the people of Kilpisharvi were emerging from the cave, blinking in the light like creatures born underground. The children ran onto the snow, and their footsteps made no sound on the hard-packed surface. Ada Spence counted them. 14. All 14. In the weeks that followed, Kilpisharvi rebuilt. But the rebuilding was different than before. Gerald Voss, who could no longer write with his damaged hand, dictated a new territorial assessment that recognized Elsa's cultivation of the Northwest Cove as a legitimate homestead improvement. He did not find a legal precedent for it. He wrote one. Josiah Pembroke, who had offered Elsa train fare to Helena, instead extended her a line of credit backed by the future value of the timber she was growing. He had calculated the growth rate of the geothermally fed trees and realized they would reach harvest size in 8 years instead of 20. It was the soundest investment in his portfolio. He told people this was why he did it, and maybe it was, and maybe it was also the memory of standing in a cave with his teeth cracking while a woman he had tried to buy off handed his children dried elk meat. The willows grew, the spruce grew. By the following autumn, the cove shoreline looked like it had been planted a decade ago. The willows thick and bushy, the spruce pushing 3 feet tall, their root systems extending under the ice shelf in a web so dense that when Elsa cut a hole and looked down into the warm water, she could see a mesh of white roots like a living floor beneath the ice, and swimming among the roots, drawn to the thermal water, cutthroat trout, dozens of them, sheltering in the warmth, breathing among the roots. That was what the ice had held. Not a secret, not treasure, a place where living things could gather and survive. Clara Pembroke came to the cove in March. She brought her children, and she brought 3 apple saplings she had ordered from a catalogue in Portland, and she asked Elsa if the thermal soil might grow them. "I don't know," Elsa said. "We'd have to try." They planted the saplings together. Clara's hands were still scarred from the blizzard, the skin shiny and tight across her knuckles. She worked the soil with her palms flat, pressing the mud around the roots, and her children handed her the grass for the insulation mounds, and nobody said anything about where fins come from. Elsa stood at the edge of the cove that evening after Clara left. The light was going, and the lake was enormous and still, and the steam from the thermal crack rose in a thin column that caught the last sun and turned gold. Patka stood behind her, chewing something. The willows along the shore moved slightly in a breeze that smelled like sulfur and snowmelt, and the particular green smell of things that refused to stop growing. She took out Twyfo's journal and opened it to the page with the star. Living lattice underneath the ice. She ran her thumb across his handwriting, the pencil marks almost worn smooth. She did not say anything to him. She did not need to. The trees were saying it. She closed the journal and put it back against her ribs and stood there for a while, listening to the roots breathe under the ice and the trout turning in the warm water and the slow, patient creak of a frozen lake deciding inch by inch to become spring.